product that I want to discuss today is an infrared laser-based dental instrument. The product is designed for use by a dentist or hygienist in the dental office, and it uses lasers for the procedure and is controlled by microcomputer with various sensors, cooling system, and controls. And it's a new use case for this type of laser. So when the client reached out to us, they had already built 5 or 6 prototypes and successfully tested them. They had prototype documentation for the components, the assembly procedures, that identified suppliers for the parts, and they were doing changes based upon what they learned when they were doing the beta prototypes. They wanted us to build 10 systems, so we quoted them on what we thought it would take to build them. And they decided that they would supply all of the custom parts because they had done that for the beta and they already had the suppliers spun up to do it. So they just needed to have a couple of changes made and they were ready for a pilot run. They asked us to go out and get the commercial off-the-shelf components. Those components had generally reasonable lead times, but where something was a problem, our customer might have had some in stock or something, so it could supply whatever was missing. So it came up pretty quickly as far as getting the material in here for us. So we then started to build the 10 pilot units using their documentation. And this is a very reasonable and typical way that we would start a project is our customer would do a beta. Sometimes we might be involved in the beta, but in many cases, we get involved at the pilot production stage. And the customer will consign material to us. We'll buy other material. And then we'll start going through the manufacturing process, documenting it as we do. And once we begin to build the product, it becomes clear that modifications need to be made. We're no longer engineers building the product. Now we've got production personnel that want to build the product. So everything has got to be very precisely defined so that they can do it correctly.
So our role in developing the manufacturing process kind of started a little bit at the tail end of the beta prototype, because as they were building those beta prototypes, they were writing down instructions, creating some rudimentary manufacturing process for how they thought it would be manufactured. They wanted to have a set of documentation available to be able to hand off to us so that we could orient ourselves as to the general flow of building this product. Our job was to review that documentation and identify gaps in it, because a lot of times when you go from a beta prototype to a pilot prototype, betas tend to be built by the engineers who have designed the product. They are intimately aware of all the bits and pieces of it, to the point where they can build it glossing over a lot of detail that somebody who's never built it before may not have. They may not have that background. So we look at the documentation as we're building these pilot units and identify those gaps. And it kind of starts with the component specifications. As John said, they were going to supply all the custom parts, but we still wanted to review those documents so that we could lend a manufacturing eye to them. And then for the COTS parts that we were supposed to buy, sometimes a part number may not be fully complete, fully defined. So this is the opportunity in this pilot production run to nail down all those part number discrepancies or suppliers discrepancies. Sometimes on a BOM, the person who's designing the product will put the manufacturer as the source for where they got a part, not necessarily who makes the part. So just those things that we have to clarify on the supply chain side of it. But then when we get into actually manufacturing, we're in this pilot production run. So we have a set of documentation that wasn't present when the betas were being built. But as we go through it, it's our job and responsibility to identify the gaps in that documentation. So there may be instructions written down, again, written by the engineer who designed the product, and there may be some detail that isn't present in the documentation at that time. So the pilot production run we use those opportunities to identify the gaps and fill those gaps. So the beta prototype really helps us develop a framework for a manufacturing process. The pilot production run verifies that documentation for the product to be built, to remove any ambiguity, errors in the documentation, a lack of detail, or undefined points in the assembly or the test process.
Just to contrast what a beta prototype does and what pilot prototypes are for. Beta prototypes are used for testing the product to see it performs the function as intended for the customer. This would be internal testing at the customer, demonstrating the product to the customer, and in some cases, letting the customers take one away and try it themselves so they can get a little bit of application feedback from the customers. But they know that it's not the real product. It's probably not up to the safety standards that the real product would be. The pilot prototype, all of those issues need to be solved. And the pilot prototypes, once they're built, they can be used for safety testing because they're identical to the proposed production units. They can also be used for design and application validation. So this is where you run it through a series of tests and you can confirm that it does everything that the customer needs it to do and it meets all of the design specifications. It allows the manufacturer, us in this case, to do process validation so that we're sure that the procedures and documentation that we have in place is sufficient to yield good product. And pilot prototypes could be suitable for sale to end users because they'll meet all of the safety testing requirements by the time we're done with them. Speaking of testing and test processes, our customer had an idea of what needed to be tested during the process. We helped to kind of refine that a little bit, and we use kind of a risk-based approach to doing the testing. So it kind of covers the risk of discovering a problem when it's very inconvenient to fix it. This system has a laser that is very much built into the product in a way that if you had to change that laser, it's very difficult to remove it from the product. The product's kind of built around it. So the product really is that laser. So before we started to add a lot of value to it, we would test that laser, test it for power, test it for that there's a cooling system with it. So we're testing it for leaks because it would be very inconvenient if we had to, I don't know, discover where the leaks were and fix the leaks after it was installed. Not impossible, but that's what kind of drove us to do testing right when we take it out of the box, run a bunch of tests on it to make sure that it's good to go before we build it into the product.
A little bit of that, right, is you have to think in a manufacturing process about value add. So in this particular product, one of the most expensive parts is built into the assembly in such a way that once you build it up, it's very challenging to get it out of the product if it doesn't function properly. From a value add standpoint, you wouldn't want to take this particular component and build it all the way up into a product only to find that it doesn't work. And then you have all that effort to disassemble the product to get the bad component out to replace it. So from a risk standpoint, we've identified those components and we do preliminary testing on a bench of just that component so that we know that units or components that are getting built into product are functioning as we expect them to, or we add the value of building them into product.
Another risk that comes up, and a reason why we would do testing, is the risk of injury to the customer, but also assembly personnel. So you think about when you're going to power this thing up, we want to make sure we do electrical safety testing on it so that the product is safe for us to work on while it's operating. And also, these are high pot and ground bond tests that make sure that everything is properly grounded in continuity so that when it's used in the field, it's not going to injure anybody. There's also a risk that the product won't meet the performance metrics. So that's a whole field in itself where we work with a customer exactly what does the shape of the beam need to look like, exactly where is the focal point. And there are actually two lasers in this system, and they're collinear. One of them you can see, the other one is infrared and you can't see it. So the laser that you can see is used to aim the laser that you can't see. So they have to be lined up very carefully. So that was a whole test method that we had to come up with to align the two beams and demonstrate that they were aligned and document how aligned they were. So that it shows how we're working on risk mitigation, on safety, on meeting the performance, and also documenting that we've met that performance, because that's all part of a medical device, and this system is a medical device.
I want to open a discussion about the sourcing of all these components. In this particular instance, our customer came to us where they had developed particular relationships with particular suppliers on particular components, which is great from our standpoint. But the first thing that we do when we get a new product like this is we review that BOM. We qualify our suppliers for sheet metal and machine parts, COTS parts. In this particular instance, we worked with our customer to kind of blend the supply chain, where they specifically handed off certain suppliers of certain components to us, where we'd be placing the orders with suppliers that they've directed us towards. And then in other instances, for a generic sheet metal part or machine part or things like that, we'll go out to our established supply chain because there's a relationship there, they're qualified, and we bring them into the specifications that our customer has provided to us as purchase specs. With the suppliers that are new to us for this product, it does require us to put a certain level of additional inspection on the parts that are being brought in, because with new suppliers, there is a certain element of risk associated with the part to make sure that what we ordered is what we got. So we have to set up that supply chain to allow the material to come in and be processed in a way that we know, number one, it's the right part, and number two, it's a part that's going to work in product. So in this case, again, the customer handed off a couple of suppliers for a couple of key components just because they had the relationship developed, and specific criteria for the components had already been defined. So that criteria was handed over to us to execute on purchasing. And then other parts of the BOM, we were free to go out to our established supply chain to get the components to the purchase specifications.
One of the issues that we recognized pretty early on, this infrared laser was very heavy. It weighed all by itself probably about 60 or 70 pounds. And it has a bit of an elevated center of gravity if you were to stand it on end. If it toppled over, it could damage the product, or if it toppled over onto somebody, it could harm them. It was pretty clear with all of the lifting and moving it from bench to bench, somebody was going to drop it eventually. And I don't want to tell you how much it cost. So we came up with a method on how we were going to get it out of its shipping container and onto a platform that we could raise hydraulically. And then we could do the testing on it at normal bench height. And we could also build the componentry that needed to go around that laser while it was on that bench height desk. In fact, we went so far as we could put all of the components on it, do all of the wiring, and there's also some tubing that goes on it as well, all of that plumbing. Then we could lower it back down to the floor and tip it up the way it was going to be used. And then we could assemble the top head of it where all of the optical components were placed. And there's an optical subassembly that we had to put together. That's on a separate path from the main laser system. So that optical head, that was heavily fixtured. We worked with our customer for wow, probably 4 or 5 weeks, with design tweaks on the fixtures so that um, we could build that system with the mirrors that it had in it and line everything up in one go. And I think we got the total assembly and alignment process down to just a couple of hours. And that's down significantly. Even with a skilled person putting it together, it was taking 4 or 5 hours to get it all lined up. So we're just finishing up the pilot production. We have another round of design changes to make based upon what we found in pilot production. So there's a design review coming up, and then they're going to release us to buy material, and they want us to start as early as possible next year, start building 2 units a week and ramping it up to 4 units a week later on in the year. We're setting up to do that. And if we can get the material in here, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape, because we did have the opportunity to use all of the fixturing and work out all of the bugs in the fixtures while we were doing the pilot.